Awesome. We are going to continue with our conversation, but moving from a more general discussion of yesterday towards the specifics. So today's lecture is going to focus on what is known as the leopardoscopy tradition. The leopardoscopy, as I explained yesterday, the name leopardoscopy comes from a very small hill that is about 2 kilometers to the east of Khami World Heritage Site in southwestern Zimbabwe. That is the very first site where ceramics and material culture of that type were found by archaeologists in southern Africa. Hence the name the leopardoscopy. What happened was that after the discovery, which was in the 1960s, if not 50s, similar sites were discovered all over southern Africa, including at K2 and Mapungubwe. So that is why K2 and Mapungubwe are also leopardoscopy sites. So it's just a name which has been transferred to other places. But as we will see, the leopardoscopy sites, regardless of where they are associated with some specific cultural features. So to move from the general to the specific, the leopardoscopy has been divided into two components. What is known as leopardoscopy 1. If you are in South Africa, that the equivalent of that is K2. So K2, that's leopardoscopy phase 1, and then it develops into leopardoscopy phase 2, which then is Mapungubwe. If you go to the north, you have what is known as Mambo. That is leopardoscopy phase 1, and then you have Woolandale. That is what is known as leopardoscopy phase 2. But I'm not going to be using those terms, and when I use them, I will explain what I will mean. So the focus of today's discussion is centered on 3 archaeological sites that have generated a significant amount of debate over the last 3 years. The first one here is Mapela. So this is a terrace wall, which is a dry stone wall. It's about 1.5 meters high, and this is a terrace where houses were built. Then we also have another place, familiar by now, which is Mapungubwe. And then we also have this very small hill, which is an archaeological site called Mutanye. The reason why I have this Mutanye is that in response to a publication that suggested that Mapela could have been a capital of an independent state, Tom Huffman said, no. Mapela could not be a capital, but Mutanye could be. So that is why we are having it in the discussion. And as I said yesterday, the destination where we are going is at a place where we will be able to evaluate all this evidence, hopefully on Friday, when we present the closing arguments. This is a map of Southern Africa, just to orient ourselves in terms of the places that we are talking about. So at the level of this scale, K2 and Mapungubwe are basically at the same place. This is Mutanye, which would be in Gwanda, southwestern Zimbabwe. Mapela, that's closer to the border with Botswana, and then Bosuswe is somewhere there, and that is the leopardoscopy main crawl. So Khami is probably somewhere here. And then, of course, there is that Great Dike which runs across roughly in this area, where there are also greenstones, and a significant amount of gold was exploited in that area. So that gold could have sustained some of these polities. This is a map from Katrien van Warden's 1998 paper. So she is talking about the distribution of the leopard scopy. And one of the things that we have to bear in mind is that you have to be creative to become an archaeologist. Otherwise, how do you come up with these diagrams and patterns? To begin with, this distribution is based on the available information. But what Katrien is showing us here is that you have a southern leopard scopy based at K2 and Mapungubwe, and then you have a northern one, which leopard scopy, that's southwestern Zimbabwe, and here we are in the Francistown area, so we are in Botswana. And then there is something in between here where we find Mapela. She is not sure where to classify it. And then we also have some developments that are taking place here, particularly around Bosutswe and Totswe. So what this suggests is that archaeologists at this point, which was in 1998, they were unsure, or at least we are not confident in terms of what are the actual relationships between these places. Where does Mapela fit? Why is it that it's not inside here, or it's not part of that? What is going on? Again, we will be able to explore the evidence from the site. So again, a variation of the same map, just to emphasize the point that the leopard scopy sites, which are hilltops with a little bit of walling, kettle crawl, glass beads, and so on, they are widely spread in this landscape. So it's not just Mapungubwe, it's not just K2, it's not just Mapela, it's not just leopard scopy itself, but there are quite a number of sites that share the same characteristics. And also to mention the fact that the leopard scopy is associated with ancestral Shona people. But then the question is, who is Shona? Who is Shona in the sense that the label Shona is an invention of the missionary Doc. So in 1929, Doc, who was the professor of African languages at the University of the Witwatersrand, was asked by the then government of Southern Rhodesia to convene what was known as the Southern Rhodesian Missionary Conference. The purpose of that conference was to come up with a unified language. So that is when we begin to see the name Shona appearing. But there are different groups. The northern leopard scopy is sometimes associated with speakers of Kalanga, and then other places like Great Zimbabwe, they are associated with Karanga people. So the whole leopard scopy would be Kalanga, and then if you are in this area, there is Karanga. If you go further up north, there is Korekore, Zezuru, you have Manyika, Ndau, and so on. But then everything is now referred to as Shona. Was it Shona back then? I don't think anyone can answer that. Just to update you on that one. So I gave the definitions of states yesterday when I said that in simple terms, a state should be able to exercise authority over two monopolies, should be able to tax, and it should also be able to legitimately use force. So how do we recognize political power? And how do we also recognize states in the archaeological record? What archaeologists do is that in some cases, they go into the ethnography, they go into the historical record, and they look for signs. So if we were to go to Shaka Zulu's capital at Kwadukuza. How does it look like? If we go to Umgungundlovu, which was Dingane's capital, what do we see? On the basis of that, you also realize that at the capital, those capitals had the largest cattle kraals, and the kings or chiefs, they also owned the biggest heads and so on. And the other information that comes out is that there was also a hierarchy of control. In terms of, you would have a capital, then you have a provincial center, you could also have a district, sub-district, village, and so on. But the most important thing is that whatever level you are talking about, from the capital back to the village, each level is associated with courts. A court as a judiciary center. So the biggest one is normally at the capital, and invariably next to those courts, you would also find very big rubbish dumps, what archaeologists refer to as middens. So that's how archaeologists, and normally those middens, they adjacent to cattle kraals. So it's very easy to pick them up. And also there are a number of early travelers, Abose and Domas and others that have recorded that. John Campbell recorded a similar phenomenon amongst Kadichkwene, which is just outside Azirast. So that's some of the information which archaeologists use to identify political power as well as to identify wealth. So settlement size is also another indicator of the political importance of a place, but maybe not always, which also translates into the number of people that would have been resident at a place. So some of the numbers that in places such as Botswana, one of the chiefs owned 5,500 head of cattle, and which was 1/7 of their entire head. So emphasizing the reason why cattle kraals in the capitals have to be bigger than everyone else. And the same applies in other contexts. So possession of cattle was also a springboard to political power. You could exercise that option. You could convert wealth in cattle into wives, children. You could also access labor. You could also use cattle in diplomacy and so on. So the most important observation from all this is that political power can be archaeologically measured. So using some of these ideas, archaeologists then identify archaeological sites and then give them different levels of significance, from capital, maybe provincial centers. That becomes a little bit tricky, but nevertheless we attempt to do that. And then there are also levels of organization. So if we say Mapungubwe is level 6, what do we mean? If we say K2 is level 4, what do we mean? So in terms of these levels, again, this is informed by the ethnography. So paramount chief, senior chiefs, petty chiefs, ward headmen, and then family head. So to get to number 6, we just add a king here. And then you will have your six levels. So according to, this is a diagram from Huffman's 2007 book. The different levels that we are talking about here. If we have paramount chiefs, senior chiefs, and so on, these are the approximate populations that one would have in a state. So Mapungubwe state. The belief is that it would have had about 500,000, and Huffman's thinking is that 5,000 of these resided at the center. Of course, there is some debate around the appropriateness of these numbers, but this is just something to work with, something to process, and to give us some ideas. So, with this brief general introduction, allow me to go to the Shashi Limpopo and start talking about the archaeological site of K2, which, as I said, represents the leopard-scopy phase 1. And it is also associated with the beginning of state systems in Southern Africa. K2 is about innovation. It is about connections with the Indian Ocean world. It is also about long-distance trade, and there is a lot of elephants in this area. So, and also archaeologists excavating at K2, they found a significant amount of ivory shavings, which suggests that this place was indeed host to people that worked and processed ivory. So K2, yesterday I mentioned Schroeder, and then Mapungubwe will be in between here. So K2 is a very important place, like Mapungubwe Hill. They all constitute part of the Mapungubwe Cultural Landscape World Heritage Site. So this is the very big midden or rubbish dump at K2. This is a trench which was, I think this is Gardner's 1963 trench. Now it has since been covered and rehabilitated. So this is where we have that display center at K2. A significant amount of materials and burials in excess of, I think, more than 71, if not 94, excuse my memory, are there, but there are more than 70 burials that were recovered from some of these areas, as well as from this dump. So the burials were associated with glass beads. They were associated with different sorts of materials. And the thinking also is that because K2 was the capital, its inhabitants monopolized the proceeds from long-distance trade. And as a consequence, K2 has the most amount of glass beads when compared to chronologically overlapping sites. So if we are saying that K2 here is the capital, there are other sites that were under it. What I am saying, and one example of those is Pond Drift, and Pond Drift is just to the right of, if we are going into Botswana from South Africa, is to the right of that border post. So Pond Drift is seen as one of the settlements that were of a lesser order, but under K2. So the amount of glass beads that were recovered from Pond Drift is smaller than the ones that came from K2. So archaeologists then use that logic to argue that whoever was presiding over K2 had more power than the people who were at Pond Drift, Skootwater, and the other places. So this is just a map from Huffman's 2000 article, just showing us again the landscape and the relationship. So this is K2 and an artist's impression of how it would have been like. Initially there was this kettle crawl, but later on, this kettle crawl was covered with rubbish, leading to the development of that very big mound. So that is where the argument about the transformation of the place comes from. Initially, it was a kettle crawl, and then later on, it became a rubbish dump, resulting in the development of that big mound. So if we come to this map here, this is the central ash mound. That this one, it developed on top of on top of this cattle kraal. And then I mentioned some of these burials. This is where they were coming from at the site of K2. The excavations during the rehabilitations, this is how deep this is. I think it went up to 3, if not 4 meters. An accumulation of activities in a relatively small period of time. I also mentioned the fact that K2 was important for crafting, and ivory being one of them. So these are some of the ivory materials that were recovered from K2. There is controversy regarding the provenance, the source of this. Is this local or is this imported? I'm afraid I can't help with an answer, except to challenge you to also come up with ideas of your own. Is this local or is it imported? And why is it that it's different to some of the other ones? We can talk about that later. The ivory here also was exchanged with glass beads that we are seeing here as part of the broader Indian Ocean trading system. So some geochemical work performed on these glass beads suggested that some of these glass beads, they came from somewhere. Where is Cairo? Probably somewhere here. Some of them came from Fustat, which is near modern-day Cairo. Others came from the Arabian Peninsula, and then there are some that came from India and others from Indonesia. So quite an eclectic collection of glass beads from different parts. But what it does suggest is that if we are to talk globalization, then by the time of K2, which is AD 1000 to AD 1220, globalization was in full swing. And we know that by the time of the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, that is around AD 800, a lot was AD 100, sorry, I beg your pardon, something was happening in this area. So K2, important in terms of long-distance trading connections. These are also some of the glass beads. There are some glass ingots or glass pieces that were also imported. They were remelted locally to produce a distinctive type of glass beads, what are known as the garden rollers, such as these ones. So import glass, remelt it locally, and then perhaps trade it. No gold has been found at K2, but it is possible that they had knowledge to work it, because other leopard scopy phase 1 sites, particularly on the Zimbabwean side, they do have traces of gold working in the form of crucibles with some gold prills inset some glassy slag. K2 is also associated with a move or a transition towards a centralized control of ritual. To begin with, ritual is done away outside settlements and at places such as Liokwe, which is one of those camps in the Mapungubwe National Park. But then, so some of these rain-making ritual hills, steep-sided, very awkward for settlement, and so on. And nevertheless, they do have evidence of material culture. But what then happens is that we also see around AD 1220, the rain-making is there are some traces of rainmaking on top of Mapungubwe Hill. So that, according to Huffman and his students, that marks the beginning of the centralization of ritual. And some of these holes here are the cupels. There is quite a very interesting debate, because if you grew up in this landscape, you would know that you would find them naturally. But then in this context, they are interpreted as evidence of rain making. So the the rain man or rain woman is then mixing medicines in some of these to, petition God to open the skies and so on. That's one of the interpretations that makes me highly uncomfortable. I must be honest with you. So this is the Shasha Limpopo again. So why developments at K2, arable land, and also there is a thinking that this is the Shasha River, and this is the Limpopo, and then from this area here there is the Kolope River, which runs into, probably it joins somewhere here, if not somewhere here. So what happens is that if we have been to this area, we realize that when the Shashi is in flood and the Limpopo is also in flood, an artificial dam is created here, and then the water backs up. That water brings with it silt and so on. So the thinking is that there is a floodplain here, which would have been cultivated, and that's what would have sustained the population. So that's this has moved a little bit, but this shade here has moved a little bit, but that's probably part of the floodplain that archaeologists believe was cultivated. Let's think about the Nile. It rains and then it floods, brings the river Nile, brings with it the silt, moisture, and so on. This is the same model which is being applied here, but is the Nile, is the Egyptian context similar to this one? We can debate that. And then this is also a map that shows us some of the resources which K2 and Mapungubwe here would have had access to. So there is evidence that, so tin here we are talking of Rooiberg, and there is evidence that Rooiberg tin was mixed with copper to produce bronzes at both K2 and Mapungubwe. So from K2, settlement and power shifted to Mapungubwe, which then became a capital, believed to have sheltered 5,000 people. One of the observations that we need to make is that this is a distribution of Mapungubwe type sites, and Mapungubwe is the center here. But what is happening is that the politics of modern day boundaries is also affecting this distribution, because the archaeological sites here in Zimbabwe and also here in Botswana, they are not there, which gives the impression that Mapungubwe only extended to the South African side. But that's not true. And there are some of the maps that actually, if you remember, some of the maps that I started with, those distribution maps, they suggest that the leopard-scopy, the distribution extends into Zimbabwe. It also extends into Botswana. So our knowledge of these areas is also conditioned by the politics of modern day political boundaries. So from K2, around AD 1220, archaeologists believed that there was an ideological shift which was associated with centralized control of ritual and the emergence of a sacred leader who stayed in ritual seclusion from commoners on top of the hill, and there was also a judiciary center where commoners and others were tried, and then the elites were on hilltops as well as the commoners on valleys. Like I said yesterday, class distinction is characterized by having the elites on top and the commoners on the flats. So that is the explanation which is used to explain the transition. So these are just some diagrams from Hoffman. He is using a cognitive structuralist model, which is based on polar opposites, private, public, back, front, and so on, to interpret the use of space at Great Zimbabwe, at Mapungubwe, I beg your pardon. So the palace, that's on top of the hill, and then the wives, they're also on a section on the hill. The court is below, and also the followers are below. then the guards, they do form a ring around that. So these are some of the maps of Mapungubwe, showing Mapungubwe and K2, showing that transition, and that's infrastructure for rainmaking, according to Huffman. So the whole idea associated with these spatial shifts, if we may call them, is that Mapungubwe Hill was more suitable for the expression of the ideology of class distinction, where you have elites on top and then the followers on the flats. But how many rulers, how many elites could you fit on top? So was it last year or the year before, I attempted to count the house floors that were recovered on top of Mapungubwe Hill, and I think it's about 15 or, maybe between 15 and 20. So if we use the logic that inside one house, how many people can you fit? So probably, maybe, even if we say one person per hut, or maybe under the extreme circumstances, if we say 7 people per hut, multiplied by 20, we end up with 140 people. Is it realistic that we can have 140 people here? I don't know. This is just playing mind games with numbers. But what it just suggests is that perhaps the population would not have been very big. So you will end up with an elite or rulers, probably maybe one family, and everybody else below. I'm not so sure. These are just ideas that come to mind. So this is an illustration from Huffman's 2005 book. So these are the commoners, these are the nobles, and then that's the king on top here. So even from the houses that are on top here, they are not that much. And so on. But nevertheless, this is also what makes the estimate of 5,000 people even more questionable. Can we say that all these can accommodate 5,000 people? I don't think so. So there's also some other information that is used to support the whole idea of the ideology of sacred leadership and these spatial shifts from here to there to something like this. That is amongst the Shona people. If we dip into Shona philosophies, the Shona people, when the king or a chief has passed on, they say that the mountain has fallen. And then when you are approaching the king, both literally and metaphorically, you say that you are approaching the mountain. Approaching the mountain also in the sense that you don't go directly. So when you ascend a hill, you don't go straight to the top, but you do that in a roundabout way. So that roundabout way can also be lesser order officials until you get to the king himself or to the queen herself. So that's part of the knowledge that is used by Huffman to say, well, we can talk of these distinctions of a hilltop reserved for the king because they are also metaphorically referred to as mountains. And also the idea of sacred leadership is associated, also comes from the fact that in some other communities, you can see here that the king or the chief is being carried by his followers, and in this nice Mercedes Benz. Because my grandfather is a chief, if you guys were to come to my village, then maybe I will also be here and you will be carrying me. How is that? I'm joking. Okay, so that's the whole idea about sacred leadership, class distinction, and how different data sets are integrated to give synergy to an interpretation. So after combining all that information, this is then Huffman's interpretation of Mapungubwe Hill, royal wives here, and then that's a royal cemetery, and then you have soldiers, then you have the palace. This is that stone wall, maybe the only stone walling on the summit, and then there is some here, and then there's the perimeter wall. So that's Mapungubwe for us. Just if you have been to Mapungubwe, this is that exhibition which is on the foot of the hill as we go up, just showing the depth of the excavation. So here it's covered, and that's the way to the top. Just to give you some more shots in terms of the general landscape, that is the Mapungubwe summit, and a little bit of some rough walling over there. Pictures from the 1930s. These are some of the burials and the associated gold. And also the Mapungubwe golden rhino. Some of these, so the rhino amongst the Shona is associated with kings, is also associated with chiefs. So its recovery from one of the burials on the summit of the hill has also convinced archaeologists that that was where the king used to reside. There are also some of these spectacular gold objects of gold work. This foil is very thin. It's probably 1 millimeter thin. So it was attached perhaps to a wooden core, which has since decayed and leaving this outer shell. And there are also some of these different objects, again recovered from the burials. Then there are also these discs, which are just normal pottery with a hole at the center. These are known as spindle holes. They were used as flywheels in the spinning of cotton. So you would just pick a piece of a stick and then connect this end here, and then you also connect that end there, and then when you have more sticks, then you can use that as a loom for spinning cotton. So that's how the technology worked, and indeed there are indigenous species of cotton in the area around Mapungubwe. The thinking is that this would have been exploited bark cloth, but that is also not to exclude the fact that Mapungubwe would also have imported cotton cloth from the Indian Ocean. So these are some of the glass beads from Mapungubwe. These ones are coming out of Cairo or Fustat, again part of the Indian Ocean trading system. Mapungubwe declined, and some of the reasons put forward for its demise include climatic factors. The thinking is that around AD 1290 there was a deterioration in terms of the climatic conditions, and as a result, the people at Mapungubwe could not cope, resulting in its demise. And then the rise of Great Zimbabwe has been put forward as one of the reasons why Mapungubwe declined, because Great Zimbabwe is believed to have taken control of the lucrative long-distance trade that was bringing in the glass beads and so on, which the elites would have been using for patronage purposes. With the loss of that power, Mapungubwe is believed to have then gone down the tubes, literally. But of course, these are all possibilities. The fact is that actually the Shashilimpopo area was not abandoned, despite the fact that Mapungubwe Hill was abandoned. We see people actually coming into the valley at that point in time, and we also see the development of platforms are similar to the ones at Khami and so on. So the formative period of the vendor state. But nevertheless, this is what archaeologists believe. From Mapungubwe, let me shift to another site. This time, southwestern Zimbabwe. This is the site of Mapela, which is also a hilltop settlement. It's actually much bigger than this. It could not fit in the photograph. But the issue is that we do have stone walling, and we will see more of that. Mapela was discovered by Peter Galek in 1968, and he suggested that it was a capital of an independent state. There is a lot of glass beads houses that are similar to the ones from Great Zimbabwe and Mapungubwe and so on. So let us explore a little bit to see the nature of the archaeology of Mapela as a way of building a bigger picture towards the development of a comparison. So this is the map of Mapela, and compared to that one little wall on the summit of Mapungubwe Hill, all the black that we are seeing here, these are all terraced walls. And I'm going to show you close-ups of them. The good thing about Mapela is that unlike Mapungubwe, where there is a settlement at K2 initially, and then there is also settlement at Mapungubwe, at Mapela you have the leopardoscopy A and leopardoscopy B at the same place and in stratigraphic succession. What I'm saying is that the lower levels at Mapela, they are leopardoscopy 1, even on top of these walls and so on. So that is where the debate is coming from, where some of us are saying, well, if the archaeological evidence is suggesting that the leopardoscopy 1 could develop into leopardoscopy 2 on the hill, to what extent should the hypothesis that there were spatial shifts and so on, to what extent should that hypothesis hold? This is a debate that we are currently having, and we also have these massive stone walls, which are also associated with prestige, with power, as well as with class. And certainly, you can also talk of class distinction if you want, because this is the summit, and then this is, I think, it's about 90 meters high, and as we can see from some of the condos here, it's terraced through and through. So the suggestion is that one would have more people at Mapela than at Mapungubwe, but certainly not in the range of 5,000. That's way too much. These are some of the terrace walls at Mapela, quite extensive. Not anything that you could see at Mapungubwe. There are practical reasons for this. This is a steep-sided hill, so for you to create space sufficient for building houses and for constructing cattle kraals, you also needed a very tall terrace wall. But the result is that we have very massive walls during the time of K2 and also during the time of Mapungubwe. And this is why K2, why Mapela is significant. You also find some of those bowls, and this is just at the top of the hill and the surrounding environment here, Mopane and the like. These are also cattle kraals at Mapela itself. So this is just looking down from the hill. Coming to this map, we are talking about this area here. So this is the cattle kraal that we're talking about, that I just showed you. This one. And then if we go into the bigger environment, so this is the Shashi River. And that's where young boys, they do a lot of quad biking in there. Also have those features like cupules and so on, similar to the ones that we have seen in the Shashi Limpopo. The pottery from Mapela, they look like this, exactly identical to what you find at K2 and Mapungubwe. This is some of the walling. And this is perhaps better you can see all these walls and the like. So that's massive hauling. Not anything like we have seen at Mapungubwe. Then there was debate on whether a cattle could climb up this hill or not. So one day, as we were working at the site, we realized that the cows were on top. That's why we have this shot, just to demonstrate that, well, actually you could have cattle cross here, because if the cows can climb that high, then surely in the past they should have done that. Then there are also, some very neat and nice walls. These are slabs of red sandstone. Again, this is a terrace wall, but at the outer, the face wall, very nice. Again, at the site of Mapela. So excavations in progress, and these are some of the glass beads coming out of Mapela. From one of these excavations, we got more than 120,000 of these types. What is the significance of glass beads? One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that glass beads were rarely used as individual units. So you can't just use, one grain of, one glass bead as a single unit, but they were combined. Let's think of the ethnic, vendor dress, those aprons. Let's think of the Isitosa aprons or the Zulu aprons. How many glass beads are required to make one of those aprons? And so if we find so hundreds, thousands, so if we find 20 glass beads, should we be excited about that? I don't know. I'm just challenging us to say sometimes the way we assign significance on the basis of these numbers and so on, we need to perhaps reflect a little bit deeper. These are the radiocarbon dates from Mapela, again, just showing that's the same time period as Mapungubwe. This is a comparison. When I published the paper on Mapela, one of the reviewers said that I was saying this because I was a Zimbabwe nationalist. I didn't want to see South Africa having World Heritage Sites. But of course, let's compare these side by side. This is Mapela. This is Mapungubwe. This is the only stone walling that you have, and you have quite a lot here. The argument is not about which place is more important than the other. No. That's not the argument. The argument is rather that we have places that have more or less the same characteristics on the landscape, widely separated. So what we are saying is that if we have these places that are widely separated, why can't we talk of different ascenders where state formation are developed, rather than placing ourselves in a very difficult situation where we say that state formation started at Mapungubwe, it went to Great Zimbabwe, which is 300 kilometers away, and whilst we are ignoring these places that are in between. That is part of the argument. So whether that makes sense or not, that's another thing. Before I open up for questions, let me just rush through another archaeological site, which is known as Mutanye, and it's also in the Gwanda area of Zimbabwe, and that's right on the edge of the gold belt. So that's a very small hill, as we can see. It's quite a small site. Nevertheless, there are middens here, and there are also middens at the back. The Umzingwana River runs probably about 5-10 kilometers in this direction, and they are still doing alluvial gold panning even today. So that's an archaeological site that is in the gold belt. The associated materials are exactly the same as the ones from K2, Mapungubwe, as well as Mapela. But the most interesting thing about Mutanye is that, as with Mapela, it has leopardscopy 1 and 2 in stratigraphic succession. So this is a map of Mutanye. Again, that small hill is terraced. It also has these terrace walls. And so what happened is that the site was excavated by Tom Huffman in 1972 as part of the Rhodesian Schools Exploration Society, because what used to happen back then was that the museum people would take interested school children, and then they would also get exposed to archaeology, which was actually a very good idea. So these outlines were produced by Huffman. So what we simply did is, because Huffman was saying, well, he can accept that Mutanye is a capital of an independent state, but not Mapela. So we were just curious. We said, let's go and see what's there. So what we then did was that we realized that there is this terrace walling which did not appear on Huffman's map. So Huffman's map was just these outlines, and then this A and B, and then what we simply did was to add this detail inside and the terrace walls. So exactly it looks like Mapela and some of Catherine Van Waarden's sites in Botswana. So this is some of the walling. This is basalt, the rock which is in this area. So you can still find some of these features, which in this area they are used for grinding, for milling gold, and so on. Which is why to some is surprising if then they are associated with rainmaking and so on. So, but nevertheless, these are some of the archaeological features at Mutanye, some of the excavations, and then some of these beakers from the excavation, the same as what is they're similar to what one could find at K2 as well as at Mapungubwe. I don't know if these illustrations mean much, but to me they suggest that the ceramics, the designs and so on is just the same as what one would find at Mapungubwe and so on. So if we come back as a way of wrapping up today's discussion, if we come back again to the whole idea of, northern leopardscopy, southern leopardscopy, and something in between, we realize that there are so many similarities, and to the point of even questioning that division into north and south. And also it would suggest that perhaps places like Mapela here, Mutanye would be somewhere there. Perhaps different polities, who knows? Again, just to familiarize ourselves in terms of the geography of these places. So to conclude, again, building on from what we discussed yesterday. So the kind of major issue here is that we see that there are a number of places on the landscape. I've just given you a few examples that share similar traits to K2, Mapungubwe, Mapela, and then Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe has a level that is known as a period 3, is the equivalent of leopardscopy, and there are also many other places. If the situation is like that, is it therefore appropriate to talk of that linear model where we say that state formation started with Mapungubwe, and then it went to Great Zimbabwe, from there it went to Khami. So in 800 years, Southern Africa had 3 capitals: Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, and Khami. This is what we are saying if we believe in that. Can we have questions? Yes, sir. Sorry? The same thing. It's the same thing. So a dolly hole is one of these holes that are drilled into a rock. So it's used. Repeated grinding can create a hole. The outcome of that is what is known as a dolly hole. So that is also what some people refer to as a cubble. It's just a hole that is on the rock. So what we fight over is what does it mean? You know, is it cultural? But there are so many natural cubbles. If you go to the Shashi Limpopo, the weathering of the sandstone, it creates those features. Are they cultural? Are they natural? Yes, ma'am.
What was found in the middens? So they didn't have plastic and Tetra Pak in those days.
Sorry?
What have you found in the middens?
In the middens. Different kinds of things from animal bone, ash, broken pots, remains of plants, so like sorghum, bent sorghum, glass beads, and so most of the middens, they do have domestic rubbish. So what was perhaps when people have swept the house and then threw away the rubbish, then it accumulates. Also have food refuse in there as well. But unless you encounter a burial, because sometimes people were buried in ash, in those ash middens. Unless you encounter a burial, sometimes the intentional burials, they are the ones that contain spectacular objects, such as the burials from the top of Mapungubwe.
Those were just the big chiefs in the...
Yes, they were the big chiefs, but equally, there are some burials that were excavated by Katrine van Waarden and colleagues just outside Francistown in Botswana. They also had a lot of pots, a lot of glass beads, but not as much as Mapungubwe and so on. But what I'm saying is that you tend to find more material in burials than you can find in middens.
And have you found any trace of agriculture?
Yes, bent or carbonized sorghum seeds. So remains of granaries, you do find sorghum, you do find millets, and sometimes you also find inside the pots there are these remains of bent food and so on. One of the projects that I'm working on at the moment with colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin is scraping the layers, the inner layers of the pots, and then looking at them for the protein to try and identify whether the pots were used for milking, for dairying practices, what was the starch that was used, that was cooked or that was prepared inside some of those pots. And we are also making recourse to advanced satellite techniques, remote sensing. That's the word that I was looking for. Advanced remote sensing techniques to look into the issue of ancient field systems. It's easier in some areas, it's more difficult in others, particularly in contexts like Great Zimbabwe, where the area has been repeatedly affirmed. You lose the signature for those ancient fields. But if you go to a place like Nyanga, then because of those terraces, it's very easy to pick up that signature. I don't know if phytoliths, those impressions of silica that are left in the soil, but retain the cell structure of the plants. That may also help in terms of understanding agricultural practices and so on. But one interesting question relating to agriculture is to what extent were the crops that were grown drought resistant? So that's something that we are also working with together with our colleagues here in molecular and cell biology. You probably know Jill Farrant and so on. We're trying to see if we could get some information on that. But so far there are more challenges than successes. I guess that's why we are into research. There were hands here. Start here and then we go to the back.
Is there any significance or correlation in the heights of these various sites? Mapungubwe seems to be the biggest. It's got the fewest terraced around. The fewest terraced there, and then are there other hills that are just ignored? Is there a correlation
First of all, perhaps what determined the settlement location? For people to say, of all the hills that are around Mapungubwe, why should we choose to settle here and not there? There could be cultural reasons. There could be, even the whole idea of a sense of place. Views and so on. Why is it that we like to settle, to buy houses like the people who came before us, where they would actually build their own houses? Some hills, though, do have significance. Spiritual significance. Some of them are sacred. That may have attracted a settlement. But in terms of sizes, that's why one of the biggest questions we are having at the moment is, does size matter? Because you have a small hill with, a lot of material culture, and then you have a big hill with nothing. How do we measure significance? But if we, on the balance of, on the combined weight of the different strands of evidence that we have, what can we say? If we have more stone walling, if we have a bigger hill, if we have more glass beads, if we have more houses, surely that place ought to be more important than the other. But again, I had to use the word, we will still be speculating. Yes, ma'am. Salt.
The salt, yes. You said they're trading gold and salt and ivory. And I'm just curious about the salt.
Salt is a commodity that is found in just outside the Soutpansberg mountains. They are what are known as in fact, if you go to, what town is that? Sanin? Yeah, that area. So there are those salt works at Baleno and other places. That's where the salt could have been coming from. If we cross the Limpopo, there's also quite a lot of salt going into Shirezi and the other areas. In Botswana, Suapan, and in that area, there's also salt coming from that area. Again, if we remove the modern political boundaries, then people perhaps were free to move. The challenge is, unlike other commodities that we can provenance using scientific techniques, can we do that with salt? Probably not. There was a hand at the back. We go there, here, and then perhaps we take the last two. At this point, no. But it would make sense to suggest that if not the slave trade, then slavery would have been part of these communities. So the slavery, as in the sense that most of these kings and chiefs, some of them they did own slaves. So we cannot discount them. If we go to the Indian Ocean coast, though, from around AD 900, 1000, 1100 or thereabout, people like Masudi are also talking of, some small-scale slave trade. Could it be that these regions were also involved? Possibly. But we are also limited by the fact that in the absence of documentary evidence, there isn't much that we can say. But there are studies that people are performing these days, looking at the isotopic signature, so looking at the carbon 12, carbon 13, as well as the nitrogen, to reconstruct the diet. So you can tell if somebody was living very well or was worse off. So on the basis that can we infer that these ones were slaves and these ones were the masters? But then how do we separate the poor from the rich? And also we know from Cape Town, there are some studies that were done from the city center here in Cape Town, where it was recognized that because the slaves, they live with their masters in the same house, so you can't expect the diet to be different. And given that the isotopes also give us an average of the last 10 years, that's a very interesting dimension, but of course moderated by those limitations. If we have, okay, last two.
Current occupants or the people who live around Mapungubwe, they speak the same language as the people who live around Zimbabwe? That's the first question. Second question is, if you're walking in the veld now, are you able to see, just by walking, by looking around, what area has been occupied 1,000 years before by
The good thing of being asked more than one question is that you just choose to answer the easiest. Yes, when you are walking in